Well, hello and welcome back once again to In the Growth Space. I'm your host and growth coach, David Mcglennen. I'm super grateful that you're here and I'm really excited about this particular episode. I'm really looking forward to sharing it with you. So today I have a guest on and an interview, a conversation really. I hate to call them interviews, but it's really a conversation with a new friend of mine named Melony Texidor. Now, Melony has over 10 years of evolving leadership experience in higher education, where she honed her passion for helping people succeed at the individual and organizational levels. Now, her ability to develop leaders is apparent, and you're going to hear this in her conversation and some of the things that she shares today, but especially around experiential learning moments. She's got some really great tools and tips, especially around imposter syndrome. Take some notes around her comments around imposter syndrome, and I'll come back at the end and share some of my thoughts, but I really like that component or that part of the conversation. She's got some really practical tips. But today, Melony is pursuing her PhD in organizational leadership, and she plans to continue teaching leadership skills and develop organizational systems for individuals and teams and companies. And it's such a great conversation. And I want you to know too, that we can learn from all of these conversations. And that's really why I've been bringing these conversations to our podcast so that I can, quite frankly, so that I can learn from some of these individuals and also then just sharing that learning with you as well. So without further ado, let's get into this conversation with Melony Texidor. Melony, welcome to In the Growth Space. Really grateful to have you here today. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for this conversation, actually.
Yeah, me too. Me too. You know, I know that you have been involved with a lot of business growth and organizational growth and learning within organizations. Tell the listeners a little bit about your background and some of the things that you've been working on.
Sure. So I have worked in higher education for over 10 years, but while working in higher education, I have found that I am most passionate about helping leaders develop and organizations develop and the culture, organizational culture develop. And so after working in higher education for 10 years, I decided to go for my PhD in organizational leadership. And while I'm doing that, I left higher education for a little bit just to go ahead and focus on nonprofit organizations and working with organizations in their strategic planning, leadership development, professional development. And so that's kind of what I've been doing lately, other than lots of schoolwork. I've been working with various nonprofit organizations, churches, for-profit organizations, and still dipping into higher education here and there and working on these foundational leadership development pieces.
Oh, that's fantastic. What do you see as some of the key challenges to organizations when they're wanting to grow and they're wanting the organization really to develop? What are some of the hurdles?
Yeah, so it's interesting. And one thing that you'll start to learn about me is that I love experiential learning. And so I'm going to want to talk about that. But before you can start diving into things like experiential learning and growth, you have to overcome some of these other trials. And one of the things that I've really found within all of the organizations, nonprofit, higher education, for-profit, is there is this underlying theme of the imposter syndrome. Yeah. And I know that is something that is been talked about amongst organizations and leaders, but it's not talked about enough when it's personally applied. So the imposter syndrome is like a collection of feelings of inadequacy that persist despite evident success. So despite all the external proof of competence, there is this intellectual fraudulence that a leader feels. For instance, I worked with a leader who had been a CEO of a company for 20 years, and he came to me afterwards and said, you know, it's interesting. I started this company and I feel really confident about my abilities, but there are times where I look around the room and everyone that works within my organization has a degree or more, and I don't. And so I suddenly start to question myself as to whether or not I am capable of leading them because I don't have the credentials. And that is something that a lot of leaders struggle with, even at the CEO level. If you do research, people like Tom Hanks, Sonia Sotomayor, Shonda Rhimes, they all have been in different interviews saying that they also struggle with imposter syndrome. So this is not something that is foreign. This is across the board, despite what kind of organization, leaders are struggling with this imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
And the reason why that's so important to point out is because that can inhibit growth.
Yeah.
For both you personally as a leader and for your organization, because if you are stuck in this imposter syndrome feeling or this feeling of inadequacy, that's overriding and possibly deterring your judgment. Yeah. And so before I do anything with organizations, I want to call that out. Yeah. And so we'll do various activities because I love experiential learning. And one of the activities that I do with them is naming the imposter.
I love that.
And what we do is I ask them to do that, just that. I ask them to name the imposter. So Patricia Wehrhahn, she has this framework. It's moral imagination, usually used for solving ethical problems. And so she tells you to see it clearly, see it differently, and then solve it creatively. Huh. And I think this still goes along with naming the imposter. If we can name it and then reframe it, we can create something different before we walk into these, what we feel are impossible situations sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that.
And so what I typically ask them to do, and this is just a little side trick for anyone listening, if they want to do this with their team, a little experiential learning activity, is I ask them to name that imposter. Is it fear? Mm-hmm. Is it doubt? Is it a feeling of inadequacy, like I shared? Is it shame or unworthiness? Like, what is that? And where does that come from? And just think through it and name it. Sometimes it's a fear of sounding unintelligent, or it's a fear of embarrassing yourself, or whatever that may be. Name it and write it down, just big, bold letters on a piece of paper. And then I ask them, set that aside for a second, and then name 3 things on 3 different sticky notes, 3 things that you have already accomplished. And people will name things like degrees, of course, but they'll also name things like running a marathon or raising children or things that are obviously difficult, but that they have accomplished. Then I asked them to name 3 other things that motivate them. What wakes you up in the morning? You know, you had a previous podcast on knowing your why. Yeah. And so being able to pull that back out again and name 3 things that motivate you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then what I do is I ask them to put those sticky notes on top of that word. And what this is doing is this is acknowledging that imposter, that fear or doubt, it's not going to go away just because you named it. It's still there. Mm-hmm. But you're intentionally putting your accomplishments and your motivation ahead of that.
Gosh, so that is great.
You're reframing it before you walk into these meetings or these conversations or these presentations. You're saying, I am capable of this because I have already accomplished these things. And someone somewhere thought I was intelligent enough to put me in this position in the first place.
Yeah.
So it's such a great activity. And it kind of feels silly sometimes, especially to some bigger leaders, but it gets that out of the way to allow for growth.
Gosh, I really love that practical step because I talk to leaders all the time who struggle with the thing we call imposter syndrome or imposter experience, as Amy Cuddy calls it. And I think this is really a practical step to be able to really be intentional with and almost visually putting it in its place, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. How has that been received by leaders that you've worked with? What's been the impact?
Yeah, it's interesting because it varies. Some people love that kind of thing, and they're not taking the time as an organization to think through, one, what is inhibiting my growth personally, and what is inhibiting this organizational growth. They're not taking the time to reflect on that. And so that's one thing that I get away from that is when people come talk to me afterwards, they're like, what I really appreciate is that we took the time to just think through this. Because even if I'm not necessarily connecting with it, I can see the organization is stuck in this feeling of we don't have enough resources to do what we want. And that's what we're focusing on. So we are dismissing our mission right now. So even organizationally, people are starting to see like, so there are things like imposter syndrome, or there are things that are inhibiting us from growing. And we can't even have the conversation of growth until we name these inhibitors.
Yeah, I think you just hit on something too, not only just naming the inhibitors, but actually taking the time to sit and think. I know too often we're always, I say we, but a lot of businesses and business leaders are just wanting to keep moving forward as fast as we possibly can. And there's this myth that fast is better. And in reality, yes, fast is good, but also intentionality is better.
Absolutely.
And taking the time out to be able to think about these things. I think there's a lot of leaders who discount that need, don't you?
Absolutely. And I see that all the time. And that's why when I talk about experiential learning, people are like, oh, we're going to do a bunch of activities. They're going to make us get up and do all these things. But if you look at like David Kolb's cycle of experiential learning, he actually put in the cycle time for reflection.
Yeah.
So it's not just the experience. And sometimes people think that experiential learning is study abroad trips and ropes courses, team builders, things like that, which, all of those things are
Those
great
are fun.
too.
Yeah.
They serve other purposes, but it doesn't have to be that way. It just has to be a concrete experience that can happen within the classroom, within a training environment, just an experience, but then it has to be followed by reflection.
Yeah.
Because what happens in that reflection time is that people have just had an engaging and authentic experience that they need to personally reflect on in order to get their thoughts around what just happened, what they just experienced. And then they come back together and they pull concepts out of it. They pull themes out of what they experienced. And depending on the experience, everybody's going to take away something different from that. So when you put experiential learning into an organization, the people within the organization, the members or the followers, however you may indicate those, they end up feeling like they're more a part of the conversation instead of just being talked at and told what to do next. It's not as a training, it's more of a interaction. And that reflection period allows everyone to take away from it what they experience and then give voice to that and be able to say, well, I pulled this out of that experience, which is completely different than what maybe the leader pulled out of it. So like one of the things I love to do with organizations is I ask them to make their big wish list. If you had ultimate, like all of the resources, what would be your big wishes for your organization? And it's interesting because I'll ask all of the people in the room, and it's if they invite the majority of their organization, sometimes they even invite customers or stakeholders, other people like that. So when they're all doing these big wish lists, the leaders will hear some of those big wish list items and be like, well, those are things that I can provide. But the other people didn't even know that. And so it's getting these ideas just out there. And then that final step of actively implementing it. So then, okay, so we had this discussion after we had an experience and everybody reflected on it. We pulled out these themes and concepts. So now what? Well, we can actually do some of these things. We can actually go and implement some of these things that I didn't know you all needed until we had this experience together.
Yeah. It seems to me that the experiential learning offers the ability for everyone in the organization to, in a lot of ways, be empowered and to really be empowered to think and to contribute their best thinking, their best efforts, and their best energy to the growth of the organization and moving it forward. I mean, am I seeing things right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what it is. And it's getting everyone personally to critically think through their role and their place in that organization, but it's giving them the opportunity to speak into the goals and mission of that organization. And it just builds such a cohesiveness amongst the team that if it becomes a habit of that culture, the whole organization can be transformed. And that's kind of my goal when working with these organizations, is not just to come in and do a training, but it's to help them see the impact of that one training that had on their team. And hopefully they begin to want to insert experiential learning, more reflection time, more dream time for their team to continue building that culture and that cohesion.
Yeah. You just used a word, the cohesive teams, I know is such an element of growth and being able to grow in a very sometimes exponential way. How do you help teams really get that cohesion?
Well, of course, it goes back to breaking down some of those barriers, right? One of the things about doing the imposter syndrome exercise, or even doing other exercises like that, it helps create a vulnerable space. Yeah. So people end up being more authentic in that space, and we kind of get rid of, and I know this isn't always easy, and it's not always, there's not always the ability to do this, but the titles are not present in that space. We're people who are working toward a common goal, and we all believe in this mission because we're all here. And so we're all going to have this conversation as peers that want the same thing. And so when you break down those barriers and you allow for a space of vulnerability, transparency, and authenticity, then you start to see people really speak the truth of what their experience is and what they want for the mission and for the organization. And it allows for that cohesion to happen. So some of it is just those relationships that haven't had time to build. And, you know, it's interesting because as we're like working through this season of the pandemic, we are coming back to, we're just now getting to a place where organizations are starting to ramp back up and get into another regular scheduled normalcy, I guess. They're so focused on, okay, we need to get back to making a standard amount of money or producing enough. They're so busy with the day-to-day trying to get that back on track that they're forgetting that the relationships are what build the organization in the first place.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. So this is more of a question that kind of popped into my head just now, is how do you get companies to start thinking like this, though, and to think more like, yes, I know we've got to produce, X number of widgets, and I know we've got to get, our top line revenue and our EBITDA numbers going, but how do we get people to think and have some kind of a rhythm of being able to really think more deeply about these issues?
Right. And it's tricky because of what is the purpose of your organization and what are the priorities of that organization? These conversations are helpful. Sometimes it's just not in the forefront of their mind. The bottom line is in the forefront of their mind. The needs of their stakeholders is in the forefront of their mind, but they don't see the direct impact. They don't get that immediate affirmation of this is worth it. So that's why you saw throughout the pandemic, the first things to go were contractors and trainings that did just this, because that's more of a long-term discussion and goal. And you see that progress over time. You see the culture change over time. So that kind of got put to the side because they had to preserve for their day-to-day. And I get that, but we have to start prioritizing this again. And it's having these conversations and being able to show, even just with one training. Our friend Steve Gallagher, one of the things that him and I talk about a lot is if we could just get one session with a team and show them the difference in just how they interact with one another after that session, they could see the value in how that's going to impact their bottom line, how that's actually going to impact the culture of their organization. But because it's not in the forefront, really the things that shake people up is when they get bad evaluations of the organization, or when they have something hit their human resources department, and then they're suddenly like, okay, we need someone to come in and kind of help us with whatever's happening here. That's suddenly when they're like, okay, we need to step back and think about these things. But I don't want it to get to that point. I want them to start thinking about it now so that their members know that they are heard and cared for, and that they can build this culture and cohesion within their team so that their organization continues to grow and they continue to thrive as leaders rather than waiting for something to fall in order to fix it.
Yeah, that's so key, Melony. Leaders have to recognize that when their people are really fully engaged and when their people are thriving, that's when they're going to get the best out of their people. And it's not that we want to get something out of our people, but that's the best contribution towards our mission, right? And being proactive about this, stepping away and really thinking more deeply about what it is that we're trying to accomplish and overcoming the obstacles that are getting in our way. I really think that more organizations ought to be thinking about this. And so that's really one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the podcast, is because I know how valuable this is. And I know that you've had a lot of experience in helping organizations be able to overcome these things. What have been some of the, like, I don't know if you can speak to this or not, but what have been some of the results of being able to overcome some of these obstacles and really overcome some of the challenges of imposter syndrome and the challenges that we've been talking about?
Yeah, some of them are real immediate. So I start to hear back from people who are a part of the training or leaders that were a part of the training that just said, this brought to light a lot of relationships that I need to work on. It brought to light my ability or inability to speak up and put voice to the things that I value and that I'm passionate about, that I think will actually help this organization. Like, what is holding me back from doing that? So some of it was immediate, and it was a personal feeling of, I have room to grow and this is the time to do it. So that's been great. But organizationally, I've seen them integrate systems, like better systems of communication, better systems of how are we going to come together regularly and discuss these types of things so that we don't lose this momentum. And so while maybe they don't continue to bring me into the picture, they are now creating systems and patterns that are helpful for their organization. And that has been the best compliment, is that if I can leave you and you're creating a new and better habit, then that is going to help your organization. And that's ultimately the goal. So the results are not so much, oh, suddenly your organization is so successful. It's more of I love hearing the personal stories of growth, but then seeing that they are creating these systems and these different habits that are helping their organization be sustainable, keeping this momentum going beyond whatever conversation we started with.
I'm so glad that you talked about that, because I think that the systems of communication and having a new system of communication is, I think, is a key for every organization. I mean, so many, if not all of the organizations that I go into, communication is a key factor. And communication isn't just a one-way street. It's a dialogue, and it is a cycle. It's a process, right?
Right. And that cycle of feedback is needed, but we get so stuck on this hierarchy of, I'm going to report what we just discussed down to my direct reports, and then they'll report it down to their direct reports, that they don't create time for the feedback to come back up.
Yeah.
Right. And so these systems of communication are helping that come full circle. It's a constant feedback loop, and it allows for people to speak into some of the top decisions. Now, it's made clear that doesn't mean that we're going to change our direction because there's this feedback. It just means that we're creating a space for everyone to be heard and for ideas to be shared that we might not have thought of at the top level.
Yeah. So interesting. I'm working with an organization right now where that feedback is really revealing some things that you just said, like the top leaders hadn't thought about certain things. And because they're getting this feedback, now they're able to really see things in a different way and say to themselves, gosh, we really never saw that before. We didn't realize. And it's so funny to me, because you would think that they could see certain things, but because that feedback is coming back to them, it's really helping to open their eyes to what's really going on in the organization. And I think that is a key factor for helping companies to grow, is really not being afraid of that feedback.
Absolutely. And it's funny to me because when you think of an organization, and from an outsider's perspective, you think the organization is a body, and this is not a way for us to say the leaders are not being considerate, because that's not true. It's that we're forgetting the other body parts. So the leaders have this vision, and they have the ability to make some pretty big decisions, and they know which way to go, and they have specific skill sets for their position. But the people who are on the ground doing some of the work also have a skill set. Yeah. And so we forget to tap into all parts of the body of the organization, knowing that the people at the top or the people making the bigger decisions, the leaders, are going to have a different perspective because they don't see some of the day-to-day things that are happening.
Yeah.
But the people who are doing the day-to-day are also not understanding the pressures of the leaders. And so it's not who has a better idea or who's making these decisions over another. It's collectively, we're all bringing a different perspective. And if we're looking at wanting to meet the mission of the organization, we need all of those perspectives. We need the body to work together.
So in my mind, as you were talking, that's exactly the thought that came to my mind, is that if we want to accomplish our mission, if we want to keep striving to really see this mission accomplished, we have to be able to work together as a body, as an organization. Yeah, that's okay. How important is emotional intelligence to this whole process for leaders to be able to receive the feedback and then implement the feedback? And then I know you're smiling because I you know where I'm headed, but I just think that emotional intelligence has to be super important.
Oh, absolutely. And I love that you did a whole segment on emotional intelligence for that reason, because just like the beginning, when I talked about the imposter syndrome and having to name that before you can have that growth and that discussion, emotional intelligence plays into that as well. Understanding how you're receiving feedback, how you're giving feedback, understanding that certain words or certain things might hit you differently than it hits other people. And even as a leader, being able to understand that within your room, within your organization, within that space, what you do is going to take on different forms for different people. Mm-hmm. So acknowledging that before you start making these decisions and start having these trainings is important. But emotional intelligence is what drives all of this. It's how we're going to hear it and how we're going to receive it, and then what we're going to do with it. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting that you bring that up, because it is such a core to some of these organizations, but a lot of times they don't talk about that either, because that again is one of those things that, well, why do I need to know this? And what does it do to help my bottom line? Or what does it do to help my organization to grow? But ultimately, it's just going to give them a different perspective as to how to have some of these harder conversations in these planning meetings. You know, Edgar Sheen talks about humble inquiry, and it's more, it's the art of conversation, right? And we think, oh, well, you know, conversation and communication, I've been a leader for however many years, I can do this easily. But he talks about, no, you intentionally are asking questions because you want to know, not because you're seeking an answer.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And it's something as simple as being able to have conversations and ask intentional questions to the members of your organization to get the actual feedback that you need for your organization to thrive. And you'll miss it if you aren't understanding emotional intelligence and understanding how your words play a part in the way that you are communicating with your team and the way that your organization is being ran.
Yeah. And it's not just the words. It's so funny you say that, because just this week I was working with a leader and he told me about a situation that triggered him. And what's interesting is that the words that he used weren't necessarily inflammatory or anything like that, but it was the tone, it was the tonality. And it was not, humble inquiry. It's really wanting to truly know, as opposed to asking a question to assign blame,
and that's absolutely.
That's where I think that there's a lot of leaders that may miss that we have to be able to get into our mind this behavior of practicing blameless problem solving and not being inquiring to assign blame, but inquiry so that we can get smarter and grow.
Absolutely. And I'm going to play devil's advocate here, though, too, is that leaders feel the need to ask questions that way in defense, because leaders take on this responsibility of the organization. And because they're not viewing the organization as this is us as a team trying to work towards this goal. This is me, and you're now attacking me personally. So I'm going to ask questions in defense of that. Yeah. And so it's trying to help the leaders understand that it's an ugly cycle that society has set for us with this top-down hierarchy, but that they can make that difference by just integrating some of these aspects, by integrating experiential learning, humble inquiry, and just intentionally being aware, their tone, the way that they're asking questions, being able to flip that upside down and seek that feedback and receive it well. And they have the choice. They have the power to do that. But I do know that is not our automatic response as leaders. Our automatic response is, well, this is my responsibility. Therefore, I'm going to be defensive when it comes to anything I'm doing within it.
Yeah. If you don't mind, go back to humble inquiry for just a minute. What are some practical ways that leaders can use humble inquiry to be able to really to practice that and to really connect, their heart and their head?
Oh yeah, and it's funny. So Edgar Schein actually has a book just on this.
Okay.
And so he actually walks through the different skill sets that's needed and how you do that. But first, it takes that bit of humility, right?
Yeah.
So you have to know I'm going into this conversation. And while I want it to go a certain way, that's not how I have to approach it, because then I'm asking questions, seeking a specific answer. And that's not what I want to do. I really want to know. And so first, they have to change their mindset. And really, it goes back to that growth mindset. I want to really learn from this conversation. I know that I would prefer to hear this, so I'm going to call that out. But I really want to learn from this conversation. So I'm going to go in with that mindset, knowing that maybe some of the things I learn are not going to be something that I'm going to like to hear. And then they start asking questions that are seeking the information from the people within that room. They're seeking the information, but they're not seeking a specific type of information. And he gives lots of examples of questions. Of course, there shouldn't be any yes or no questions or one answer questions. Of course, they're all open-ended questions, but it's really, how can we evolve as an organization? What would those steps look like to you? And, and it's even applying it. So sometimes when I'm with various organizations and they have all these different departments there, if this decision was made, how would that impact each of your areas separately? And having them think critically through that, so that it's not just a one way, hey, I would like to make this decision. What do you think? That's them implying, well, I want them to tell me that they think it's a great idea.
Right.
If you're asking, how would this impact your department if this decision was made, then they individually get to think through, okay, in my department, within my role, if this decision was made, these are the things I would have to consider. And then they have that open discussion, and the leader realizes, I knew that it would impact this part, but I didn't know that it would impact these other things that you're now mentioning. So it's going in, really seeking that information and structuring your questions so that information, it creates a space for that information to flow.
Yeah, you touch on something that I think is so powerful, and that is the power of questions. And, there's one thing that I know about great leaders, and that is that they ask questions. They ask great questions. And I think that not only do they ask great questions, but they come at it with this humility of really wanting to know, because they recognize that they don't have all the answers and they can't see everything. And I often use the analogy that, look, I don't have eyes in the back of my head, even though I know moms do, but dads don't. Funny little joke there. We used to tell our kids, hey, look, mom's got eyes in the back of her head. She sees everything. Yeah, see? But I have blind spots. As a leader, I have blind spots. And so I really want to know, and I need to see that, even if it hurts, even if it stings a little bit. And so that's where that humility comes in. But asking great questions with the idea of, I just want to know, I think is really critical for all leaders and all companies who want to grow. And I think that's really important component.
No, and you had hit on when you said I have blind spots. A leader getting up in front of his team and saying, I recognize I have blind spots. That is a powerful moment.
It is. Yeah, it really is. It's so funny because I was just with a leader this week, and we were doing a team launch, and I was so proud of him because in this team launch, he basically said to his team, hey, look, guys, this is my first role as a manager. I don't have all the answers, and I'm sure that I have screwed up and I will screw up again, but I want you to know that I want us to work together as a team. And so when I screw up, I need to know about it. And man, that kind of humility is going to take a leader a long ways. And just the recognition and the awareness is I think the first step. And there's a difference between being confident and being, cocky, because certain leaders, they think confidence is like, look, I'm right, I'm the leader. And that's not it at all. Great leaders recognize that they don't see it all. So I guess that's my point, but that ability to articulate that in front of a team, like you were just saying, is really an important moment to build trust within the organization and within the team.
Oh, for sure. And it's funny because I can always walk in a room and tell the leaders who have that confidence, and then those who are a little bit just cocky.
Right.
And it's funny because they hold a different aura, basically. And a lot of it goes down to those who have confidence, but can be humble. They have a lot of respect. There's a lot of respect within their organization, and you can tell by their interactions. You can tell by their conversations when you walk in the room before any kind of training. Whereas those who maybe they don't have the relationships and they just think, well, I make the decisions around here. They don't talk to anybody. They walk in and sit in their seat and they kind of wait for the training to start. And that's also very recognizable. Yeah. And so it's funny because while you may think that people don't notice, or people assume that, well, he's the leader, so that's why he's sitting over there. No, they're taking note of those who are friendly and confident and humble. And that is super recognizable than those who just come in and say, we just need to do this. And we have to do it because the organization expects it, or the stakeholders expect it, or the board is asking me to do this. Those are two very different leaders. And it's very evident within the organization, and the members feel it, the clients feel it. And so it's interesting how just the mannerism in which they present themselves and the way that they conduct their meetings and their conversations and how they have their relationships will impact the culture of that organization. Yeah. It's just really felt and known. And so it goes back to this idea of, why is this important? Well, all of these conversations are important because even if it's not verbally said out loud, it is felt within your organization. If your leader is wanting to have these conversations, bring you into the conversation, build these systems of communication, it is felt whether or not they're on board with that or not.
Yeah, so true, Melony. Yeah, so I think, what I'm hearing today is that really for organizations to grow, we've got to be able to do a couple of things. First and foremost, I think on an individual level, we have to overcome this imposter syndrome and not just necessarily like dismiss it and quote unquote get rid of it, but overcome it and go beyond it. And so you gave us some practical tips to do that. And then really secondly, taking time to set aside time to think about these larger issues and communicate, having communication go all the way through the organization and really being aware of how we receive feedback, how we give feedback, and the emotional intelligence of myself to be able to do that. And then really, I think the other key component is just this idea that you talked about with Sheen's humble inquiry, being able to ask questions, not with a leading what I want to hear, but really what's the truth, and really asking more questions to find the depths of the truth. And I don't know, is there anything else that you see that really kind of hold back organizations that we haven't talked about today?
I don't think it's anything that holds back, but I think something that all of these things have a theme to them, and it's that theme of intentionality.
Yeah, I so agree.
It's you have to be intentional with yourself, your personal growth, intentional with naming the imposter, intentional with providing spaces for a growth mindset for these discussions, intentional with your systems of communication, intentional with your relationships within your organization. And so if there's anything that I would want listeners to take away is, what are you intentionally doing every day? Are you in this robotic way of just going and doing the day-to-day, attending your meetings, making sure you're checking off the list of things that need to get done for your organization to run? are you creating space for intentionality, and what are those intentional things? And take time to prioritize that. I need to be more intentional with getting to know my members or my stakeholders, or I need to be more intentional with creating this space of growth, space of dreaming, and space of communication, feedback, like you said. Where are we missing that intentionality within my organization? And that is what I really want to challenge organizations today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad you said that. And I think that for leaders who are listening, and I would really just challenge you to think about what Melony has talked about and what we've talked about in this episode. I'd really love to be able to get your feedback too. What's come to your awareness? Where are you finding a block in your own organization? Shoot a note back and let us know. We'd love to be able to hear that. And so, Melony, thank you for the time today. Thank you for really thinking through these key elements of growth for organizations, because as you said, we're going to beginning to come out on the other side of this pandemic. And I know that there's a lot of organizations they're thinking, okay, now we've got lost time to make up for. We've got to be able to move ahead, and we got to move fast. And sometimes it really is going slow to go fast. And I think there's really some key to that. And we didn't talk about this, but this just popped into my head. It's really all about what Simon Sinek talks about, playing the infinite game, right? It's not necessarily just about bottom line results. It's about continuing to keep playing the game. Absolutely. And so thank you for this discussion. This has been great. So tell people, where can people find you? How can they connect with you? And let our listeners know how they can get in touch with you.
Sure. So if you go to weadvise.ws, I work with Ideate, an advising team, and you can contact me on there. My email's on there. There's some other great colleagues on there that do individual coaching, but I do a lot of team building, experiential learning, trainings, things like that. And so weadvise.ws. And if you go to about or contact, you'd be able to reach me that way.
Awesome. And I'm assuming you're on LinkedIn, right? So I think I'm pretty sure you're on LinkedIn. Yeah. So Melony Texidor, and we'll have that in the show notes as well. But thank you so much, Melony. I appreciate the conversation today. And I really am grateful to have you on the podcast. So any final words that you'd like to leave the audience with?
No, I just thank you so much for having me. This is fun. I love talking about leadership and organizations and getting to know you and making other connections. And so I really appreciate you having me today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Well, that was such a great conversation. I really loved the exercise that Melony talked about naming the imposter and in reframing it through that exercise by creating sticky notes of the things that you're great at and putting that over the name of the imposter. And then the other thing that I really thought was insightful as well, and it's building in reflection time and just the value of putting that reflection time in, not only just after exercises like that or experiential learning in an experiential learning environment, but really on a regular basis. As a leader, we have to build in reflection time so that we can make sense out of the things that we're seeing, the decisions we're making, the strategy that we're creating, and really to be able to help us to be able to think more clearly. The other thing that Melony said that I thought was really insightful is that organizations are like a body. We need that body to work together, and we've got to support each part of the body. And so when we're supporting each part of the body and we're keeping each part of the body healthy, our organization is going to be healthy as well. I thought that was really insightful. And then just from a leadership perspective, recognizing and admitting to our blind spots so that we can frankly overcome them, I think is another a great lesson for leaders to be able to recognize and to openly admit their blind spots. So thank you so much for listening today and for subscribing. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do go out and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you consume your podcasts. And while you're there, please give us a 5-star rating and a review. I would really appreciate it. It would really mean the world to me, and it'll help us to reach more people so that we can help others grow and develop in their own growth journey. Now, finally, if you've already done that and if you've subscribed, go to my website, davidmcglennen.com/subscribe, and I've got a gift for you. So if you subscribe to the podcast, go to my website, davidmcglennen.com/subscribe, and you'll be able to download my Peak Performance Principles audio program. It's a program that has 10 audio recordings of different principles for personal growth and personal development, and I hope you enjoy them. And until next time, stay in the growth space and be well.